If you enjoy listening to the Glenabbey podcast and would like to be involved in its production, speak to me, Johnny Fleck, or email production@glenabbey.church. Now back to the episode.
You're listening to the Glenabbey podcast. My name is David Mairs and I'm part of the leadership team in Glenabbey with a particular focus on pastoral care. In today's conversation, I'm joined with Jenny Baines and Rebecca Richards, who will be sharing with us about the work of Open, an initiative of CARE, the Christian Action Research and Education, which aims to create an environment within churches where crisis pregnancy and post-abortion concerns can be shared with grace and compassionate understanding. Jenny is the UK overseas consultant for Open and has been with us over the past year to deliver a pastoral training event at Glenabbey back in February. And just this week we had an evening of remembrance for those who had suffered the loss of a baby through miscarriage, stillbirth, abortion or in infancy. She's been involved with those affected by crisis pregnancy and post-abortion concerns, so it's lovely to have you back with us again. It's also lovely to have Rebecca with us as well. She's a member of Glenabbey and is also a consultant with Open for Northern Ireland. Rebecca grew up on the North Coast but now resides in Newtonabbey with her daughter. And she is a part-time French teacher and has worked in West Belfast for over 10 years. As a church over the past year, we've been developing a link with Open to help us become a safe and supportive place for women who have experienced baby loss in whatever way. And Rebecca, with the support of Jenny, have really helped us in what we could call a journey of understanding and hopefully practical support to those we are aware who continue to work through the emotional and spiritual challenge of losing a baby. So good to have you both with us today. We're really looking forward to hearing your stories and finding out more about Open and how it supports churches and how they can respond compassionately to those affected by crisis pregnancy, abortion and other baby loss. Firstly, there's a question that we have been asking all those who have shared on our previous podcasts, just to break the ice, as we say. So, Jenny, thank you for taking the time to be with us today and through the week. Could you maybe tell us about a recent book or a film, maybe a podcast, or even a Google search that you've made in the past while?
Yeah, thanks, David. Really good to be back with you again. I had to think about this. The last film that I went to the cinema to see was actually a film called Young Woman in the Sea. And it was really inspirational film. I loved it. And it was about a lady called Trudy Edel, who was from the States, but 100 years ago, she was the first woman to swim the English Channel. And the film talks about the challenges. 5 men had done that previously, but she actually did it. And she broke the record by 2 hours. But the fight that she had as a woman, even to train and to swim and to be able to do this. And apparently, when she came back from having crossed the channel, that she had the biggest parade ever of an athlete down Fifth Avenue in New York, and yet really we don't really know about her. But I love these stories of these feisty women that really have, broken the barriers there. Just a warning, there's a horrible scene where she's battling through jellyfish, which is really horrible. Yeah. But apart from that, a great film to see.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, really an inspirational story. And maybe the same for you, Rebecca. Do you want to share?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking when you had mentioned Google search, my Google searches are definitely something like, does the migraine I have mean that I'm going to live for 3 more days? So I'll not share my Google searches. But I've been listening to a podcast actually. We had been at a conference a couple of weeks ago, a Pregnancy Centres Network conference, and we had Jo Hargreaves as our speaker there. And she is on Instagram and social media as the Faith-Filled Therapist. And her podcast, she doesn't have very many episodes in it, but it's really, really good and really interesting. And she just talks about how neuroscience, is so linked with the Bible and with Scripture. And she was talking in particular, and we were actually talking about this the other day, about where it says in Lamentations, but his mercies are new every morning, and just how there are thousands of new neurons being made in our brains every morning. And that every morning really, or every day really is a new chance, to live that life that God has given us. So I've been finding her really interesting for someone that does not come from any sort of sciencey background. I find it fascinating.
Yeah. I think the whole neuro network and how that develops, particularly in young children and all, is just fascinating, and how those things can be renewed and that. That's great. We're going to find out a little bit more about Jenny and Rebecca, and we're going to let them share a little bit of their story and how they ended up coming alongside and supporting those affected by the trauma of baby loss. So, Jenny, can you tell us a little bit about your story? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm from Lincolnshire, David, and I worked when I left school. I went to university, and then I worked as a social worker for several years. And then I met and I married my husband, Derek, and he was a Baptist pastor. And when I'm sharing my story, I always say that was a challenge enough in itself, marrying a Baptist pastor. But an even greater challenge was the fact that he was a widower, and he had 5 young children. So I often say I'm not really Jenny Baines, I'm actually Julie Andrews in disguise. But anyway, so I married this man. But sadly, he wasn't a wealthy captain. He was just a poor Baptist pastor in a very rundown manse. But anyway, that's another whole story. And so we took on, I had 5 children straight away, and they were quite young. And then we had twins and another little girl. So having married a man with 5 children, my friends thought it very funny that we then started doing it in 2s. But anyway, so we raised 8 children. But before I actually had the twins, before we had our twins, I suffered 3 miscarriages, which is something that's not really part of anybody's plan. You never think that's going to happen to you. And for me, it was, I'll probably share a little bit later on, but it was very devastating, and the grief that went with that. And that whole experience, my second one in particular, just from all aspects, the care I received, the physical aspects, it was just horrible. That's my word for miscarriage. It was just horrible. But actually, while I was in the ward recovering from the second miscarriage, a young girl came onto the ward and made no secret of the fact that actually she was coming in for an abortion, and she seemed very casual about it. Came in, had the procedure, went out again. And in those days, they had women on the same wards, those who were desperately trying to hold on to their babies and those who were coming in to end a pregnancy. So it was really difficult. But as she left the ward, I just remember very clearly just having this huge compassion for her. And that wasn't me, because I was in a dreadful state. I really was so sad. But as she left the ward, I just remember thinking and praying to God that I just wondered what was going on in her life, that she had to make that decision, which I believe for most women, not all, but for most women, it's not an easy decision to make. And I just wondered what was going on in her life, and really just prayed that God would put her in the path of somebody that maybe who could help her and come alongside her. And I think those experiences of grief, although I wouldn't want to go through them again, wouldn't wish them on anyone, and I don't believe God sends those to us, but actually they shaped my life. and from that experience, I then began to think, what is it? Why am I so grieving and so devastated? And I believe it's this brutal breaking of the bond between mother and baby, whether that be in miscarriage or indeed in abortion. And so it began me on this path of thinking about the unborn child and the value of the unborn child. But also, what about mums who've had to make that decision? How can we help them? And then eventually, it's been a real journey of grace for me, I have to say. But eventually thinking, and what about those people in the medical field that have to assist with these processes or to nurse, and it might go against their values? What is the effect on them? And so actually that experience over 30 years ago has just led me into this whole area of walking alongside women and men who've known either a crisis pregnancy or baby loss in whatever form, or have experienced abortion. So that's kind of really where I began with all this.
It's kind of like the genesis of the kind of passion to come alongside people came from.
Absolutely, from that.
And so how did that develop to where we are today? Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, well, then that happened, and then I became pregnant again. And this is, I won't go into detail because this would be another whole podcast. Just before I thought one baby was born, they actually told me I was having twins. And so I had twins. But even when I was expecting the twins, I just had already begun to be challenged by the whole issue of abortion, really. And so I began to train. In those days, there was just the Life organisation. We were living in Wales at the time. I trained with them. And then eventually, it was actually at that time, this was over 30 years ago, it was called Christians Caring for Life, which eventually became a whole network of crisis pregnancy centres. I think God began talking to churches and saying, we need to get involved in this. And so from the very beginning of that, I was involved with that network of centres and really have been walking this path alongside other ministry and stuff and raising a big family. But I've really been involved in this work ever since, I think. Yeah.
And how did you get involved in Open?
So sadly, my husband, 17 years ago, we were, as part of the ministry of our church, we had a pregnancy crisis centre in the town, a bit separate from the church, but it was run by the church, which I loved, and I managed that. And then very sadly, Derek, 17 years ago, he suffered a massive heart attack, totally out of the blue. And he died. And in that moment, I always say my life actually just changed in that minute or two when he died. And for a while, I continued managing the centre, but I felt for my own well-being and healing, I needed to change what I was doing. And God was increasingly challenging me that we need to be engaging with churches, not to get volunteers for centres, not to campaign, not to get donations, but really to encourage churches to be reaching out to men and women within the church family for whom this would be a part of their story, and how can we do that? And so eventually I gave up running the centre and I approached CARE, who I'd known over the years. They were very involved with the network of centres. And I just went to see them and I just said, this is what I feel God saying to me. How would you feel if we could base this ministry of reaching out to churches to engage with these very sensitive issues? Could we base it under the umbrella of CARE, which has been involved with these issues for men, and is just a wonderful Christian charity? And they just embraced it. And so we had the name Open, came to me actually, that we want to open up the conversation. And then for about the last, time goes so quickly, 10 or 12 years, really we've just been developing it and developing resources, and the work's growing. And it's so wonderful to see the work growing now in Northern Ireland and having Rebecca.
That's fantastic. Really, really interesting to hear that history, that story. Rebecca, great to have you with us as well. And do you want to share a little bit about your story? I'm sure some people will know you, but a lot of people probably maybe don't know you.
Yeah, sure.
And how you got involved with Open as well.
Yep. I say my journey to being where we are today right now is probably spanning quite a few years, but probably about 6 years ago. My life kind of really set on quite a different path. For as long as I can remember, I feel I've had a heart and a compassion for girls, probably younger girls who find themselves in a crisis pregnancy situation and feel they don't have any choice. And I think that's kind of where I came from. And I know Jenny's probably come from more that miscarriage, baby loss background, but I think that's where my heart for this kind of started out. But about 6 years ago, I actually found myself in a crisis pregnancy situation at the age of 30. And I think it was from there God really used this to bring me on this journey. And I just, as Jenny has said, I don't believe that God sends these kind of less than ideal situations into our lives, but he really does redeem them, and he uses them, to restore us back to him if we surrender to him and if we allow him to do that. So when I found out I was pregnant, it was quite a difficult time actually. It was quite tricky in that I was quite involved with a couple of churches just across Belfast. I had just bought this little first floor apartment in Ballyhackamore, and nothing really in my life was going to be in any way conducive to bringing a newborn into the world. And I had to have a lot of difficult conversations with church family, with my family, with friends, with colleagues. And I think just looking back, it was quite a challenging time. And anytime I'm talking about this and I look back on it, I kind of think, actually, I can see why termination seems like a really, easy fix to this problem, as it may be seen as, that arises. But by the grace of God, and only by God's grace, it wasn't anything that I'd ever considered. And that is something that actually value that I had held really, really strongly as long as I can remember. but it was complicated. There were a lot of things going on. And I have to say, the church that I was involved with at the time, actually just a church on the Antrim Road, they were so welcoming to me. They were so loving. They were so compassionate. And I think that really impacted me and really challenged me with how churches receive people that find themselves in situations like this, that aren't necessarily people that are just, people down the street or whatever, but people within their own congregations. And I think never at any point was I made to feel, actually you've made these decisions, you just, you go on, we get on with these. It was, this has happened. You've made some silly decisions, but actually what are you going to do to ensure that you continue your walk with God and actually you deepen your relationship with Jesus, despite what has happened. This is going to change your story, but actually how can you continue to walk with God as you're doing this? And I think that's just really challenging for me within churches at the minute. How do we receive people who are single parents, who are couples that are maybe struggling to have children, couples who have lost, and just even single people, people who don't have that, what we look on as being that, typical nuclear family. Like how do we as a church welcome those people? And I think that's kind of where I started my journey into this. And then just briefly actually to how I actually got on to Open then. So Rosie May was a COVID baby. I know lots of COVID babies in Glenabbey. And there was one night I was sitting in that small apartment. It was that second lockdown, and it was January 2021. And I know it was God moving in my life, because it wasn't anything that had come from me. And I just thought, how can I let God use this part of my story and my experience for him, and just to let him work through this. And I just Googled crisis pregnancy organisations. Actually, from pretty much that evening, I started volunteering with a crisis pregnancy helpline. And I did some training, crisis pregnancy training through them, or through another organisation over in England, and then post-abortion training as well. And then I saw this opportunity with Open just over a year ago, and I just really felt at that moment I'd been given part-time hours with my job, and it was just, it felt like it was just the right time. And I have to say, it's been such an absolute pleasure to be involved with churches and to be involved with these women that we get to walk alongside. And so that's how I got here, how I got to work with Jenny.
I think it's such an important issue about how churches respond and come alongside people, support them, and use that word to redeem situations. It's so important. And
it's with that compassion, and what we talk about, truth and grace and compassion, just everything that we see in Jesus, I guess, whenever.
That's great. Maybe someone listening to this podcast has experienced baby loss in their life, or someone knows a friend who's going through the devastation of a loss like this. What, in your experience, are they having to deal with? Can you maybe share from your own experience? I know you alluded to that in your introduction, but just so as they kind of connect with people a little bit about.
It's so strange. Somebody once wrote, miscarriage is a word we don't say until it happens. And I think that's so true. And for some reason, there's a silence very often, not just in churches, but just generally in society, around baby loss, especially if the loss is at a very early stage of pregnancy. And so for some women, I think the loss can just actually be devastating, and there's a total shock. Already they may have been making plans, all the potential for that life. They may have been thinking about football strips, all these kind of things for their children. And suddenly that is brutally broken. And so I think there's a devastation of loss, there's shock, total shock. And especially the physical experience can actually be quite traumatic. And then the whole thing of anger. Why has this happened to me? A lot of women feel guilt. I remember thinking, were there things that I've done that has caused this? I don't think there were. But even so, that doesn't stop you sometimes feeling, is it something I've done? These feelings of guilt with a miscarriage. And sometimes if that's not dealt with, that can spill over into a whole area of shame. And we talk a lot about this, is it something, what is wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Other people can do this. And then, of course, a huge grief And one of the problems is, especially if the baby was lost at an early stage of pregnancy, it may be that other people don't even know that the woman and their partner, that they were pregnant. And so there's no funeral, there's no acknowledgement of the loss, all the cards and the support. So all those things which help us, I know when Derek died, those things were hugely significant for me, the funeral and all the support. That's not there. And so it actually can be a very lonely and a very silent grief. And a bewildering time. And I think it's so much better now. I mean, we're recording this in the National Baby Loss Awareness Week, which is wonderful. And there's so much more awareness now. But years ago, there was very little. And so all these strong emotions a woman is having to deal with, sometimes with very little support and understanding. Yeah.
Really appreciate you sharing that. I think when we talk about pregnancy loss, it tends to be mentioned under words like either abortion, miscarriage, stillbirth, 3 different experiences and journeys, and probably the impact that they have on people is different depending on the way. Can maybe share a little into that? I'm not sure whether it's Rebecca and Jenny's going to chat a wee bit on that.
Well, of course, there are differences. I think somebody who's made that decision to have an abortion for whatever reason, alongside, I mean, first of all, I want to say that I think a lot of the recovery and a lot of the emotions after are very, very similar. And we run courses and we run retreats for women who've had miscarriage and other baby loss. And also we hold weekends for women who've been through abortions. But a lot of the emotions are actually very similar. The whole thing that I've just been saying about the anger and the guilt and the shame and the grief, and forgiveness is another huge thing. And with abortion, I think the whole area of guilt and shame is a much more significant emotion afterwards, and all that questioning, how could I have made that decision? You know, we're very wise with hindsight. And sometimes women make these decisions with the little understanding that they have. They don't have, like us, the benefit of the Holy Spirit to help them make good decisions. You know, and looking back, they can sometimes think, however did I do that? So there can be those whole things of guilt. But also with all of these 3, I would say, with abortion, miscarriage, and indeed with stillbirth, there is the grief and the anger, and the forgiveness, maybe being angry with God, maybe there are people they need to forgive. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are differences, of course. And with stillbirth, if someone has actually taken the pregnancy to full term and the child has been born again, that's increased pain, I would say. So so we have to be aware of that, I think.
Yeah, for me, it's such a big area that's almost hidden in a sense. You know, you don't really hear a lot about it, and that's what really kind of drew me towards trying to figure out how do we as a church set up an environment and provide support to people like that. And so really enjoyed conversations that I had. Rebecca really got me thinking about this here. Yeah. And I suppose it would be helpful maybe just to chat a little bit about Open and the sort of support that's provided to churches, and maybe even, you know, how are churches responding to this need? What is the size of the challenge out there, or what inroads are we actually making into that? Maybe Rebecca.
I think that varies. And I think... I think it varies, especially within our culture in Northern Ireland. I think some people can be a little bit wary as well, and it's not at all that we want to go into churches and be talking about abortion all the time or talking about baby loss, but it's creating that environment within churches where people who have experienced this can feel comfortable and can feel, right, actually, I know there is support available there if I want it. And that's really what we want to provide to churches. We want churches to feel that they are equipped, and even if they feel actually we don't personally feel we can deal with this, where can we signpost to, or where can we send people to actually get this support that they need. So one way of helping to support churches is just by our pastoral training days. So we actually had one at Glenabbey back in February, which was brilliant. And I have to say, Glenabbey, and I was saying this to Jenny, have been so supportive of what we do, and it's been so lovely. It really has, just working alongside you and the team at Glenabbey. But our pastoral training days are normally on a Saturday between about 9 to 2 or 9 to 3, where we just look at the areas of a pastoral response to miscarriage, and then we move on a bit to looking at crisis pregnancy and how do we support those who are maybe going through this within our congregations or even within, our friends, family circle. And then looking a bit at a pastoral response to abortion, and just giving people just a bit of time to hear, things. Maybe this is really helpful to say. This is helpful not to say. These are some resources you can look at, and just to see where we are even as a country with these things. And we found that actually the feedback from those days has been really positive. And what's actually really nice, what was really seen at Glenabbey that day is that, yes, we based it here and we had people from Glenabbey, but actually there were probably about 10 different churches across Belfast that were represented that day. Which I think really showed that actually the pastoral workers in the church, they want to know how can we actually support people that are going through this. And I think it is really nice. I don't know if anybody from another church is listening to this. It is really nice to remember that it doesn't have to be just a church thing. We'll only get 5 people from our church attending. What's the point? It's even using that church as a hub, and inviting people from the area, or just really open it up to anybody. And as Jenny's mentioned as well, we have our retreats, which I know we'll talk about in a wee minute. But we have those probably about 2 times a year. We'd have a miscarriage retreat, and then maybe the same for a post-abortion retreat, and just keeping churches in the loop of when those are, so that if somebody does come, to yourself or somebody within the team to say that they've experienced loss, that you can say, oh, actually, I know of this retreat, and hopefully you've sounded Jenny and I out by now, so you can be fairly confident that it'll be okay. I know of these retreats, actually, you'd be more than welcome on this, and this would be a really good, part of your healing journey. And I don't know if I've answered your question there, but
no, it's really helpful. And what I'm trying to, suppose, tease out is just what are the different things that you do in terms of providing support. I know from the pastoral training that we had, that was really helpful, certainly for me as a guy, getting that insight, I found really helpful.
And I think, just jumping in on that to interrupt you, David, I think trying to get more men on board with this as well. And we had another, might have been the other guy that was there there's maybe 3 there at Glenabbey that day, but this guy needs given us permission to share this. He had said, actually it's so important for men to be involved in this sort of kind of discussion. And he said, I've always, and he'd actually had a conversation in the past with a friend who had ended up having a termination, and he had always felt, I didn't feel like I did enough to stop her doing that, but he couldn't, it was her decision, he couldn't have stopped her, but he kind of felt, being at that training day really gave him a different perspective. And he said it's really important to get men into this discussion where it can be seen as such a woman's arena.
Yeah, I was really interested because you automatically think about the father, but yet I'm aware of a grandfather who was greatly impacted by the loss. And it was kind of like he was just reaching for support, for help. How do I work through the emotions of all my expectations that were dashed? And I want to support my daughter. And but I feel the loss as well. And that really struck a chord with me, that we don't sometimes think at that level that this isn't just the mother and the father, it's the wider family circle who have been in the journey, and then all of a sudden that journey comes to an unexpected end, and the impact and the ripple of that is huge. And I know that that individual has found open and the support and the resources really, really helpful, and that's been really encouraging that we're able to provide that and point people. It's like, oh, let me introduce you to Rebecca, and that's just been great from our perspective.
If I can just interrupt there as well, somebody once said in the area of miscarriage, that somebody once said it almost seemed as if pregnancy was for both the man and the woman, but miscarriage was just the woman who was affected. And so often the father's overlooked, and so we really want to emphasise that, both parents, and it's a men's issue as well. Like Rebecca said.
And I know I picked up some of the resources and, encouraged some of the pastoral team to get some of the resources and some of the books, and some of the stuff for guys is really, really helpful, having to flick through those and reading them. So, but we've talked a wee bit about, you've mentioned a wee bit about retreats. Do you want just to describe what the retreats are and what happens at a retreat to give people a bit of an insight, so the next time we advertise one, they have a better understanding of what happens at a retreat?
Yeah.
Shall I share about the open retreat? And then, so the open healing retreats, they're the post-abortion healing retreats, and they're held over a whole weekend. So they start usually on a Friday at 2:00 and end on Sunday after a lovely roast dinner at 2:00 on Sunday afternoon. And mostly it has been for women, I have to say. Not that men are excluded, but so far it has been women who've come. And we always say when they come, this is going to be hard work. And it's like unpeeling the layers of an onion, and I'm mixing all my metaphors, and we don't leave any stone unturned. It really is delving deeply into those emotions that I've already described. So at first they share their stories, and then we look at coping mechanisms. What sort of things have they put into place to enable them to carry on with everyday life after they've had their abortion? And then we look at anger. It's okay to be angry, but it's what we do with it is important. And we look at guilt and at shame. What is the difference between that? We don't want any woman to be living in shame. And then we have an evening where really we look at grief and giving women who've had abortions the opportunity to lay aside their part in the whole process, to lay that aside for one evening, and just to see themselves as mothers who are grieving their babies. And very often they've not felt they had the right to do that. But on this evening, they're given permission to do that. And we look at what is grief, how can we express it, what have been the problems, what have been the challenges in being able to grieve our babies when we were involved in a decision for that to happen. And it's just wonderful how God always comes alongside women in that session and speaks individually, and it's just a very powerful, very emotional session. And then we go on to look at accountability, exploring ownership, separating our part in the process, but also what part did others play? And that can be very freeing, actually. And then we look at the whole area of forgiveness, another huge subject. And as you can imagine, for most women, the most difficult, they can forgive others, and we identify all those people that they either might need to forgive or receive forgiveness from. But the biggest challenge with that is always they find it almost impossible to forgive themselves. And so we look at what God says about forgiveness, that he forgives us within those boundaries that we're going to talk about, the whole thing of grace and truth and compassion and boundaries. But that is such a liberating experience. And then we go on to thinking about moving forward and how do we now carry on with our lives, and what things can we put into place to enable to do that as we look at the way ahead. And for those who are Christians, all the potential, all the plans that God has for us, which very often, because of a hidden abortion that's never been dealt with, I know several women who've always felt that they couldn't be used by God because of this shame. But actually, in bringing that to God and knowing his forgiveness and his freedom, they've gone on really to just be, wonderfully used by God.
Maybe you use a phrase there, you used it earlier as well, about boundaries and grace and truth. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit more about what the thinking is around that? Yeah,
I think one of the challenges for us with Open, and I think with the pregnancy crisis centres around the UK, which are faith-based, they are Christian centres, but we're not there to preach at people in the centres. We have to be very careful about that. And one of the challenges is walking that tension, I think that fine line between upholding God's boundaries. When I speak in churches, I always say that I never believe abortion is a good decision, really, for any women. And I think it grieves God's heart. It's not his best for us. And he's put boundaries in his word that if we step over those boundaries, we then come into this area of guilt and shame. And really, it's not good for us. So there are boundaries there which God has put in his word for our well-being. We know that from Scripture. But also we have to, if you like, balance that with God's grace and his compassion. And I think Jesus just demonstrated this throughout his whole ministry. If we think of the woman caught in adultery at the end of that wonderful story, he says to her, "Where are your accusers?" And they've gone. He said, "Neither do I accuse you, but go. Your sins are forgiven, but go and sin no more." So God's boundaries, but also God's grace. And so it is a fine line. And some people, I think, and in some churches and some Christians, they feel we don't go far enough, we don't confront women enough with what abortion is. But I think we need to have winsome ways of doing this and to reach people through his compassion and grace. Most women know they've overstepped those boundaries. They don't need us to rub salt in the wounds. But actually, God forgives and he comes alongside. So it's balancing those grace and truth and compassion and boundaries.
That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing that. Were we going to talk about another retreat?
Well, I can share a little bit just about our loved retreat, which is our miscarriage healing retreat. And I'll not kind of duplicate too much what Jenny has said, because a lot of the format is actually quite similar. But instead of it being a weekend, it's on a Saturday. So it's on a Saturday from 9 till about 4. And we go through some of the emotions that Jenny has mentioned, but we maybe move through them in slightly less time, I guess, because we don't have as much time. But it is similar things that come up. And for these retreats, we normally try to find a really nice location, because as with the post-abortion retreat, we really want the ladies to come away from their day-to-day life just to feel like they're kind of in a bit of a sanctuary, and that they can just leave their life, for however long it is, just even for a few hours on that Saturday, just set that aside to just focus on their loss and how they can move on in a way that this will enrich their lives. And we found we had one just there back in September, just a few weeks ago in Enniskillen, and we had 4 ladies there, and just, pregnancies at very different stages and losses at very different stages, a couple of neonatal losses. And it's just, it's so precious to see the courage of these ladies as they come along and share their stories. And then also, Jenny, I'm sure you feel this as well, just with the support that they are for each other as well. Even be it by the end of the day or by the end of the weekend, they are carrying each other and really looking to Jesus. And it's just so special. I think that one of the main bits of feedback we received from the retreat there just last month was that there's a lot of support out there, which is brilliant. But these ladies hadn't actually experienced just a time where they can go away and focus on Jesus and focus on what he has done for them, and bring that, that element of faith into their loss as well, which, was just really encouraging as well.
We had an evening this week at Glenabbey, a time to remember. It was a powerful evening. I was there, and I was really, really moved. Do you want to share a little bit about what a time to remember that particular evening's all about?
It was so special on Thursday evening. So we kind of thought, with it being Baby Loss Awareness Week, it was a nice time just to mark this and give people the chance to come along. So Time to Remember is just our baby remembrance service, where people can just come along and set aside that hour, however long it is, just to remember their child or their children, and have a chance and space to acknowledge that, that this child or these children were and are so much loved. And just share that with other people as well. I think this can be so strengthening for people as well to do that within a group. But just to have that public acknowledgement. And these services, we just they're from a Christian faith perspective, but they're open to anybody who wants to come and just have that moment. But we just have a few readings, prayers, a couple of reflections, some songs, and then just a time where these people can light a candle and take a little flower just to remember their child or children, and just to have that moment to acknowledge. And I think, as you say, it's just really powerful, just to see these people and the love that they have for their children, and that love that remains there. It's just really precious.
Yeah, no, it was just such a privilege to be a part of that. When we talk about resources, I'm sure there's loads and loads of resources, but for people who are listening and maybe thinking, I wonder if I could get my hands on something, or is there something that would be really good to read? Is there anything that you guys could maybe recommend?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things, Jenny. Feel free to jump in because I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'd say as well, because sometimes I think I know when I'm listening to things, unless I have a pen and paper, I never remember anything. So if anybody does want to get in touch, please just send me a message or whatever, and I can send you a list of some resources. But I've actually brought one with me, which isn't one that I found probably until a couple of months ago. It's called Near to the Brokenhearted. And it's by a couple, Dan and Anna Martin, who lost a child. And I found this really helpful just with grief in general in life. Just it is based around baby loss, but actually for any element of grief, I just found it's really poignant and just really, really powerful. But with regard to specifically miscarriage and baby loss, you have the Miscarriage Association and also the Mariposa Trust. You have also the Saying Goodbye, sayinggoodbye.org, which is their website, which has it's got some really nice kind of just resources to point you in the direction of different support. And they also have baby remembrance services around the UK throughout the year. And also, if anybody is looking for, they actually feel they need that support, that one-to-one support for loss that they're going through, there is the Pregnancy Centres Network, which runs across the UK. And there are 2 centres in Northern Ireland. And that's where you can get that, here, the in-person support, or, you can do that online or on Zoom. And just it gives you a chance just with post-abortion to walk through some steps to healing with that, if that's more helpful, than just grabbing a book or something. Because sometimes people actually need to journey that with somebody who has been trained in that. But I have a list of books. If anybody wants to get in touch rather than me rhyming them all off now, please do. I don't know if Jenny has any wisdom she wants to add in.
No, I think you've covered it all, and you can put it on your list, can't you? Yeah, there are some great books out there.
Yeah, one of the things to pick up is this idea is just to encourage people who are listening to remind them that they're not alone, that there's people there willing to support them and journey with them and help them, and there are resources. And I think that's such an important message to get out as we're talking. We'll probably overlap a wee bit in some of the things that we've chatted about, but I'm quite interested maybe to focus in a wee bit about the church and how the church can become a safe place for people, that we can start to talk about things that have maybe been seen as taboo. Sometimes the things we believe can be a barrier to others. How do people, I suppose, think about how can I possibly talk about this in a church context? There's that fear element of what will people think? What will people say? Will they support me? Will they judge me? This whole idea of whether the people feel accepted or not accepted. I know we've talked a little bit about that, but I'm just keen maybe to chat a wee bit more, because we know that Jesus met with those who were marginalised, and he sat with those who were rejected and who were unaccepted in their society. So getting to the bottom, how do we navigate what I would refer to as choppy waters, for want of a better phrase, of that tension between loving people and opening up the Bible to them? You've referenced it a wee bit when I asked about grace and boundaries, but how do we confront people in a loving way about choices? How do we welcome people yet teach them? I think churches struggle with that. And particularly, I suppose, in the area of abortion is the bigger challenge, maybe. Have you any advice for me as a church leader? What do we do? How do we handle this?
I think it's really difficult, and I think I actually did a master's dissertation around this whole area of abortion and its place in the ministry of the church today. So the theological issues surrounding it and the pastoral issues surrounding it. And I sent out lots of questionnaires and interviewed church leaders. And one of the questions was, have you ever preached about abortion or spoken about abortion in the context sort of a Sunday morning or the main service? And I think 99% said no, although they all agreed it was a theological and a pastoral issue, and it certainly affected women in their churches. And so it's trying to think, well, why is that? And some of the reasons were really good reasons, David. You know, a lot of the men said, as a man, I feel it's difficult for me to be up there speaking about it. And another comment that came back quite often, and I felt actually was quite sad, was if I speak about abortion, I don't want to come over as judgmental, as if preaching about abortion automatically meant judgmental. And so it is working through that and think, how can we present this message of God's boundaries, but with grace and compassion? But I so think we need to do it. And it's very interesting that a lot of women, I think of one lady in particular in my home church back in England, who had a very what should we say, had a very challenging life, had dealt with lots of issues. And the church had been wonderful when she came to the church and she came to know Jesus and walked alongside her with it. But she said that there was one thing that she felt she just could not tell anybody, and that was the fact that she'd had an abortion. Her words were, I thought this would be the straw that would break the camel's back. And it's so interesting how women feel this is almost like the unforgivable sin. And of course, we know it's not. And so it's how do we get out a message that as a church we talk about these things. One very practical thing I think, and I often say, I think it would be wonderful. Most churches have websites these days that if on the church website, if they're advertising, for example, we do debt counselling, we have a CAP centre here, we do mental health, we do all these things we do. And also we do post-crisis pregnancy and post-abortion work here, that we can, and they look on the website and think, oh, that's something they talk about there. And already that helps lift that silence a little bit. And also I think, as Rebecca said, and I think you're really doing well here at Glenabbey, just holding these pastoral training days, which really, they don't make us counsellors, but they're just so that we know how to walk alongside someone and what kind of language do we use. Let's be careful of the language that we use. And I think within a church, I've had to learn this the hard way. If ever you're speaking to somebody, never assume that it's not part of their experience. We have to be so careful how we talk about these issues. In the UK, I know the statistics are very different here in Northern Ireland, but in the rest of the UK, 1 in 3 women will have had an abortion by the time they're 45, which is a shocking statistic. It's higher than the miscarriage rate. And so obviously within our churches, and especially within larger churches, there are going to be many there for whom this is part of their story. And so how can we, you'll have got the message by now, how can we make our churches places when we can share about it?
And I think as well, to kind of add on to that and jump in, I think in our minds, and maybe especially in Northern Ireland, we think of, as our law is changing, whatever, it's not the people we come across are not the ones that have had an abortion, last year. No. It's all ladies in their late 50s, 60s who have had their abortions in England. And I have to say that has nearly exclusively been my experience since doing work with Open. The ladies that we've come across in our retreats, even a couple of ladies I've spoken to, I was at a church on Monday night, a couple of ladies there. These are ladies who have carried this and who carry that shame as well, because that's from a time gone by nearly, and it's just, I think it's really important to remember when we think about our churches, and when Jenny's saying, that there will be people in our churches for whom this is part of their story, but it's unlikely to be that 19-year-old, sitting there. It's going to be that lady who may now be a grandmother sitting in there. And I think just even to say as well for our retreats, our retreats are for people who have had loss however many years ago that may be. And with our last post-abortion, it was exclusively ladies who had their abortion, I think it was between 34 and 36 years ago. So I think it's really important to remember that it's not that kind of what we hear in the media of people getting, having terminations and things. It's actually those ladies who did this because they felt they had absolutely no choice, or else they were pressurised into it, and they were literally put on a plane and taken to England. So yeah, I think it's just maybe our mindset a wee bit when we think about that.
Yeah, we've covered so much ground. In
you say we've talked a lot, David.
Which is part of what we're trying to do, and that's fine. I suppose as we look to maybe to wrap things up, we've covered a number of the questions that we had here during our conversation, but for people who are listening and maybe wanting to reach out and make contact, what's the best way for them to do that? Because you mentioned the name Rebecca and you mentioned the name Jenny, but, how does someone reach out? There's a website, obviously.
Yeah, so we have our website, which is weareopen.org.uk. We also have our Facebook page and Instagram, so our social media, which is Open UK, or me, Rebecca Richards, if you want to just get in touch. So, yeah, we'd be more than happy, or if you want to speak to Jenny about something that she said in particular, we're happy to point you in the direction of something that might support, or I'm always happy to meet up and just talk about something, whatever it may be. So yes, please do get in touch.
And if you're sitting here thinking, oh, David didn't ask me that question, is there anything that you'd like to share?
There's something I'd like to share, I think, just that, when we're talking about this with Open, not in any way have we got a down on local churches. Very often we can do better, and that's why Open exists. But I love local church. My husband was a Baptist pastor. We work very hard in our local church in the community. And have I got just a minute just to share a story, David? Yeah, because the church does do things really well. I think I want to end on that positive note as well. And actually quite a few years ago now, I was speaking at a lunch actually with church leaders talking about Open and how we don't talk about these issues very well. And a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, Jenny, that is true, but can I tell you my story? And she told me that her daughter, years before now, was a committed Christian. She was away at university and she was raped one night. And as a result of that, she became pregnant, which doesn't happen very often for all sorts of reasons, despite all the hype around the issue of rape and abortion. But still, she became pregnant. And she had lots of conflicting advice. I have never been raped. We're not there to tell anybody what to do, and she had to make her decision, lots of advice whether to continue the pregnancy or not. And for her, she just felt that she wanted to continue the pregnancy, that abortion wasn't an option for her. And I know I'm going to wobble when I share this story, but this lady said to me that the minute that young girl made that decision, the whole church came around her. She didn't have to buy any baby equipment. She didn't have to buy any baby food, clothes. The whole church came around her. And she said at the dedication service, the Thanksgiving service, it was a little baby girl that she had. When the pastor said, and who will raise this child? Sorry. She said the whole church just stood up. And I still, as you can tell, I have told that story many times, and it was a few years ago. But I find that so moving and actually so wonderful that someone wrote once, Richard Hayes, an ethicist, he wrote that within a church context, really, there should never be abortions for reasons of finance and accommodation, all those things. God calls the church to come around. And in this church they did. And this little girl went on, she's now living abroad. And she went on, she's now working in Christian ministry. So, although rape is evil, and a lot of the stuff that's happened to women that we see who have been in the most awful, awful situations when they make a decision to have an abortion, it's evil. But God can redeem those situations. And as a church, our ethos is grace and compassion. That's what we do, isn't it? And we do it really well. So I just want to say, that we do. We love local church.
Yeah, well, that's really, really helpful. Can I just thank both of you for taking the time to share your stories, to help us understand a little bit more about Open and how the organisation can support churches pastorally, come alongside those who've suffered loss. And I think that's been a really good conversation. So thanks so much.
Thank you for having us, as they say.
Yeah. Thank you.